So first of all, to draw an eye, you have to understand the anatomy of it. So how is an eye structured and what's the anatomy of an eye? Well, I've got some different examples up here. We are going to work on them later. But first of all, I'm gonna explain some basic anatomy of the eye to you. So we all know that we have eyeballs, don't ya? If you don't have eyeballs, I don't think you can watch this video right now. So, how is this eyeball structured? Well, first of all, we have the eyeball itself. So if you don't know what it just basically is the body for all the optic nerves inside the eye. Then moving forward, we got the iris. So the iris is a muscle which is responsible for widening or shortening the hole that we call the pupil. So the pupil is basically just a hole which light can come through, and therefore it then can hit the retina, which is located at the back of the eyeball. And the iris is responsible for opening or shortening this gap so a different amount of light can come through. Okay, that's basically everything you need to know about the eyeball right now. You can even see the eyeball from the outside. So if we take this picture for example right now, you can see this part here and you can see this part here, and that's where the eyeball would be, probably around here. You can do this with multiple other pictures too. You can see here this thing and here that. Boom. You know where the eyeball is. It's very easy to locate. And yeah, that's just the eyeball. Where is the eyeball? It originates from the eye socket. So the eye socket is way bigger than what we see right here. It should be around, if I draw right here, it should be around this size. Right there. Something like that. But we don't have to worry about the eye socket right now. The only thing that you need to know is that we have the eyeball here and it's sitting here, and that the eyelids, the upper and the lower eyelid, wrap around the eyeball. So the upper eyelid and the lower eyelid are not just flat shapes, for example. They wrap around the eyeball, if it makes sense for you. So if we take this right here now, for example, we would start here, we would go up, and then we would try to make it a bit round, because it wraps around this whole shape. Okay? Something we can do right here too. So we could make it like this. You know, because it's actually wrapping around this whole thing. One thing to notice that this part right here is the cornea. So if we take the pupil right now, if we take the pupil right now, and so the pupil alone would be very unprotected. That's why we have the cornea that actually protects the pupil. So it's transparent, you won't see it except for the highlight that it's creating when light shines on it. But otherwise it's fully transparent and you normally won't see it. But when you draw the eye from a side view, you will have the cornea stand out more than the eyeball because it's a convex shape. Because it's a convex shape. I'm so bad at drawing circles, bro. uh, so now that you know that we have an eyeball and you can kind of locate where the eyeball is on reference pictures, and you know that the upper eyelid and the lower eyelid are wrapping around the eyeball. They are not flat. Always keep this in mind even when you're working on perspective or something similar. So now that we know this, we will go ahead to the anatomy of the eye itself, okay? So now to the anatomy of the eye. Let's look at um, let's look at a real life example first. So the first thing I want to cover is the upper and the lower eyelid. Then I want to cover the epicantral fold. And then I want to cover the tear duct. So the eye is pretty straightforward. We have the tear duct, which is this right there. You can also see it here, and she also has it right here. Um, when drawing really stylized eyes, you probably won't draw it at all. However, if you happen to draw realistically, don't forget the tear duct, okay? So then we have the upper and the lower eyelid. Those two basically form the shape of the eye. So if you are on the Asian side, you will probably have more of an almond shape. So the upper and the lower eyelid basically make up the form of the eye, so the eye shape. It's important that you know how to draw them and recognize them pretty easily, so you won't have any challenges with drawing them in the right perspective. What's important to note is that the upper and lower eyelids both have thickness to them. So if I would draw an eye in perspective right now, then I would have to keep this in mind, because this is what makes or breaks the perspective of an eye. Right? Okay, so this is basically what makes or breaks the perspective of an eye. So keep this in mind. And the epicantral fold basically is really easily recognizable. However, if you are on the Asian side, it can happen that your epicantral fold is not visible because it overlaps with the upper eyelid. A very good example for this would be here, because you can actually see this guy doesn't really have a visible epicantral fold because it is overlapping with his upper eyelid. So you have the epicantral fold, you have the tear duct, and you have the upper and lower eyelid. So last thing I forgot to mention are the eye bags. You can see them really easily here. They are formed because of the eyeball being there and the eyelids wrapping around the eyeball. So through these eye bags, you can easily determine where the eyeball actually is and in what perspective it could be and what size it actually has. So for example, this eye bag would not fit there because it's in the totally wrong perspective. You would probably draw something more like this, or something more like this eventually. So you can kind of determine where the eyeball is and what size it is through those eye bags. It's basically everything you need to actually know about it. Things like the eyelashes and the iris, um, those are things that you can stylize however you want it. However, one thing to keep in mind with the eyelashes is that the more you go outside of the eye, the longer they tend to become, and usually they tend to become more eyelashes too, but they definitely, in most cases, become longer the wider you go outside of the eye on both sides, upper and lower eyelid. So now that we know this, we can actually look at some examples I've put up right here. If you look at this person's eyes right now, it's very clear that you can see some kind of epicanthal fold. So right there the epicanthal fold overlaps. Now that we have this shape of the eye figured out, we can look at the lower eyelid, which we can see right here, and it flows in like that. You can see that this has some thickness to it, while this, because of perspective, doesn't have as much thickness. We can still see where the eyeball originates from in some sort. Right here, right there. And there we can see the same thing with the epicanthal fold overlapping at this point. So at this point here, we can see the same thing with it. And then we still there have our lower eyelid, which has way more thickness to it than the upper eyelid. Again, because of perspective. So when we take this for example, we can see the epicanthal fold right here, and it doesn't overlap here or anything like that. It's separated from the upper eyelid, not like here where it kind of flows into the tear duct, but here it's separated. So again, we can kind of figure out where the eyeball is. We can kind of figure out where the eyeball sits and how big it is, and from there on we can just draw the eye. So here we see the upper eyelid, and now this actually has some more thickness to it because we kinda look at this person from a bit of a downward angle, and there we have the lower eyelid. Here the same thing, we have the upper eyelid and the lower eyelid. The upper eyelid has a bit more thickness to it. So one other example we have here is an eye in some kind of perspective. So again, we can look up the epicanthal fold right here and right here. It's separated again, so it doesn't flow in with the tear duct. Again, we can kind of look where is the eyeball and where is it positioned and how big is it. One thing to keep in mind when drawing an eye in perspective is that the circle has to bend in perspective too. So if you draw an eye from the side angle, for example, now, so if you draw an eye from the side angle, for example, now, um, you just you can't just go ahead and make the iris one round part, but you have to kind of put the iris on there in a more oval-like shape because it will bend in space because of perspective. Just so you know this. And this same thing operates on the eyeball itself. So you need to think about this when drawing the upper and the lower eyelid because they wrap around this then oval shape, for example. If you want to stylize it and you really have an oval eye, for example, then you would have to draw it in uh, then you would have to make way more changes, for example right here. because it has to still wrap around. This eye takes some imagination right now, yeah. But you still have to wrap around the oval then. So now that we have the eyeball and the epicanthal fold figured out a bit, we can actually look where is the lower eyelid and the upper eyelid positioned and what shape do they have. So right here you can see that the lower eyelid has a bit more of thickness to it again, even though we can see some thickness in the upper eyelid too. However, the lower eyelid is more prominent right there. Keep the thickness of the upper and lower eyelid in mind. That's really important because this is what makes or breaks the perspective of the eyes and if they look believable or not. So, like I said before, the more you go outward, the longer the eyelashes will become. So, right here you can see it really good. It would probably look something like this because she has very long eyelashes. And you could use the same thing for here. So once you know all the parts of the eye and you kind of know where things have to be, you can actually go ahead and try to stylize it. For stylization, there are some different forms you can try. However, if you know the rules, you can bend them whatever you want. So if, for example, we know that the upper and the lower eyelids have thickness to them and the epicanthal fold would not overlap with the upper eyelid. And for example, we want to make a very big anime styled eye. Then first of all, I would try and make an oval. And because we know that the upper and the lower eyelid have some thickness to them, and for example, I want to draw it looking upwards now, I would go ahead and the same rules apply all the time. I would make it I would go ahead and make it bend really insanely, and we would be able to see a lot of the thickness right there, but we wouldn't be able to see so much of this thickness right there. You know? So we would really be able to see a lot of thickness right there, but not so much there. And what we can do from now on is try to draw in the epicanthal fold and the eye bags right there. So now that we would have gotten this perspective in, we could actually go ahead and try to draw the eyeball. I'm not the most experienced with eyes, so don't don't kill me for not drawing eyes really good. So the same rule would apply if you would watch it from the upward angle. It's just that we would see a lot of thickness right there and nearly no thickness there, and it would just be nearly the same. It would nearly be the same thing. So how would you construct an stylized eye then? So the first form that most of you guys probably know for eyes is this one. However, there are still some other forms you can try out. For example, we have circles, we have ovals, or we have parallelograms. I don't know if that's what they call it in English, but we can have all sorts of forms. If you just know how to bend the rules, it will become very easy, very quickly to stylize eyes. So, so let's take this eye for example right now. So we have made an oval-like shape. So from the front it would probably look something like this. And like I've said before, you really have to look after the thickness of the upper and lower eyelid. Because if I wouldn't have drawn this one in some kind of thickness, we wouldn't know where the eye is facing in some direction. But I have drawn this thickness and we know now that I'm looking at the eye from below. If we take this parallelogram, for example, right here, we could make that I'm looking from it from upwards, and you can just bend this shape. If you choose these shapes, you can just go ahead and try to bend them. So if I would look from it from an upward angle right now, I would try and bend this shape something like this. If I would look from it from below, for example, I would try and bend this shape somewhat like this. So now that we've bent this shape, we want to draw in the epicanthal fold. Right now we want to say that the epicanthal fold is actually overlapping with the upper eyelid. So when it overlaps, we wouldn't be able to see a lot of it because we could even draw it like that and it just gets into overlapping right here or something like that. And now that you have drawn this epicanthal fold, we could draw it right here too if we want to. So like that. Now we want to look how is the eyeball positioned. So this eyeball would probably tend to look something like this, and this eyeball would probably look something like this. Of course you can draw in the iris. Just keep in mind that this has to still be in some perspective. What you have to do now is watch for the thickness of the upper and the lower eyelid again. So again, we wouldn't see much of the upper eyelid right here, while on this one we look from we look on the eye from upwards, so we would see thickness in the lower eyelid. And for this one, we would look from it from down again, and so we would see the upper eyelid more thick than the lower eyelid. So now that you have done this, you just have to draw in the eye bags again. You can play around with them in some sort. And then you're basically good to go again. So there would be the eye bags. Good. And then you're basically good to go. So yeah, that's basically everything you need to know for the eyes. Look for the epicanthal fold. Look how the eye is, how the eyeball is positioned and how big it is. Then draw a shape that wraps around the eyeball from um, from both outer sides. Don't make it too small. And then just look for the thickness. Where is it thicker? Where is it not as thick? Draw in the eye bags and draw in the eyelashes probably. And don't forget the iris. Then you probably are good to go. Thanks for watching. I hope this video didn't waste your time and I hope I could help you in some sort of way. If so, consider leaving a like because it helps the algorithm. Thank you and have a nice day.